Dr. Ethan Wallace adjusted the collar of his crisp, new lab coat, the stark white fabric contrasting against the matte, steel walls of the facility. He stood at the threshold of the SCP Foundation's main entrance, a monumental structure that seemed to consume all light that dared touch it. The air outside had a bite to it, crisp and clean, yet somehow thick with an unseen presence. It was as though the very atmosphere around this place was saturated with the weight of untold secrets, like the dense silence before a thunderstorm. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a combination of the cool air and the nervous excitement that bubbled within him. This was the day he had been waiting for, the day he would step into the world that few even knew existed. The SCP Foundation, a name spoken of in hushed tones, surrounded by rumors and speculation. Ethan had always imagined it as just another research facility, albeit one shrouded in mystery. But now, standing here, staring up at the towering facade that loomed like an ancient titan, he realized he had underestimated the gravity of this place. There was something almost alive about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The entrance slid open with a soft hiss, and Ethan was greeted by a woman in a tailored black suit. Her face was expressionless, her eyes sharp and cold, reflecting none of the warmth one might expect from a welcoming committee. "Dr. Wallace, I presume," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "I'm Agent Harper. Follow me." She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, leaving Ethan to quickly fall into step behind her. They walked through a maze of corridors, each one identical in its sterile, metallic design. The walls were lined with reinforced glass windows, but the rooms beyond were empty, their purposes unclear. Occasionally he would catch a glimpse of movement behind the glass, an indistinct shadow, a flicker of light, but nothing he could clearly identify. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the corridors, the only noise breaking the oppressive silence. "Welcome to Site 19, Agent Harper said as they reached an elevator at the end of the hallway. The doors slid open with a soft chime. "This is where you'll be working from now on. But before you get too comfortable, you should know that things here are not always as they seem." Ethan nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. He had heard similar warnings during his induction, but standing here, he felt the weight of those words in a way he hadn't before. They stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished steel. His eyes seemed wider than usual, the excitement of the morning now mingling with a creeping unease. "Your first day is a probationary period," Harper continued, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "You'll be assigned to observe and assist with one of our more manageable entities. A sort of trial by fire, if you will. Don't worry, we don't expect you to do anything you're not ready for. But be advised, Dr. Wallace. The SCP Foundation is not like any other place you've worked before. It's important you understand that." The elevator descended smoothly, but Ethan felt a strange pressure in his chest, like they were plunging deeper into the earth rather than moving through a building. There was a growing tension in the air, something almost palpable, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He could feel his heart beating a little faster, his mind racing with questions he knew better than to ask. The doors opened to reveal a sprawling underground complex, lit by cold, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. The space was vast, filled with rows of containment cells, each one marked with a series of numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him. But there was no mistaking the security measures in place. This was not a facility where corners were cut. Heavy-duty doors, reinforced glass, armed guards stationed at intervals. All of it screamed of the danger that lay just beyond those walls. "This way," Harper said, leading him down another corridor, this one flanked by thick steel doors on either side. Each door had a small window, but Ethan noticed that the glass was heavily frosted, obscuring whatever lay within. It was a deliberate choice, he realized, to keep even the smallest detail from prying eyes. They stopped in front of one of the doors, indistinguishable from the rest except for the number SCP-173. Harper turned to him, her face still a mask of professional detachment. "Here we are," she said. "Your first assignment. SCP-173 is one of our earlier discoveries, but don't let that fool you into thinking it's safe. Nothing here is truly safe." Ethan swallowed, nodding again as he tried to suppress the growing unease in his gut. This was it. His first real encounter with the unknown, the first step into the abyss that was the SCP Foundation. He had spent years preparing for this moment, studying the strange and the unexplained. But now, faced with the reality of it, he felt that preparation slipping away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "Remember," Harper said as she keyed in a code on the panel beside the door. "Never take your eyes off it." The door slid open with a heavy thud, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a finality that made his heart skip a beat. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the lights overhead. And there, in the center, stood SCP-173. A grotesque statue of concrete and rebar, its eyes fixed on him with a gaze that was as lifeless as it was unnerving. Ethan felt the weight of those eyes, felt the air in the room grow colder, heavier. He couldn't look away, couldn't afford to. The SCP Foundation had its secrets, and now, standing in the presence of one of them, he knew that those secrets came at a price. And so began his first day. Dr. Ethan Wallace stared at the dossier in his hands, the weight of it more oppressive than the thick steel walls that surrounded him. The SCP Foundation was a labyrinth of secrets, and here, in the cold, sterile confines of Site-19, those secrets were starting to reveal their true nature. He sat alone in a small, dimly lit briefing room, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. In front of him, a file lay open, the stark black letters on the cover reading SCP-173. Ethan had read the file twice already, but the words didn't get any easier to digest. A statue, at least that's what it appeared to be, composed of concrete and rebar, its face smeared with traces of unknown substances. It didn't sound particularly terrifying at first glance, but the more he read, the more unsettling the description became. SCP-173 could move with terrifying speed, but only when it was unobserved. If left unchecked, it would snap a person's neck before they even had time to scream. He closed the file, the unsettling image of SCP-173 etched into his mind. There was something inherently wrong about the whole situation, something that gnawed at him from the inside. It wasn't just the entity itself, but the idea that such a thing could exist at all. What kind of world had he stepped into, where nightmares were not just real but catalogued and contained? The door to the briefing room slid open with a whisper, and Agent Harper stepped inside. Her expression was the same unreadable mask she had worn since the moment they met, her eyes cold and calculating. She moved with the precision of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. Every step measured, every word a calculated risk. "Dr. Wallace," she said, her voice as crisp as the air in the room. "You've had time to review the file." Ethan nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, I've read it." "Good," Harper replied, her gaze never leaving his. "You'll be assisting in the observation of SCP-173 today. It's a standard procedure, but given that it's your first day, I need to emphasize the importance of following protocol to the letter. This is not the place for mistakes." Ethan swallowed, a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. "I understand." "Do you?" Harper asked, her tone flat, but the challenge in her words clear. SCP-173 is a Class Euclid entity. It's dangerous, unpredictable, and will kill without hesitation if given the opportunity. Your job is to make sure that doesn't happen. She handed him a small device, a handheld monitor, its screen flickering with static. "This will track your vitals during the observation. If your heart rate spikes or you show signs of severe stress, you'll be pulled from the room. But I'd advise against letting it get to that point. We can't afford any disruptions." Ethan took the device, his hands trembling slightly. "What do I need to do?" "Simple," Harper said. a thin smile ghosting across her lips. "Keep your eyes on it. There will be 2 other personnel in the room with you. You'll rotate observation shifts. If all 3 of you blink at the same time, well, don't let that happen." There was something almost casual in her delivery, a practiced indifference that only served to heighten Ethan's anxiety. This was routine for her, but for him, it was the first step into the unknown. And the unknown was not a place he wanted to linger. "Are you ready?" Harper asked, though her tone suggested that readiness was not a requirement, merely a formality. Ethan nodded again, unsure if he was ready but knowing that he had no choice. "I'm ready." "Good," she said, turning on her heel. "Follow me." The corridor outside the briefing room was just as sterile, just as cold, but now there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. Ethan's nerves were fraying at the edges, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could go wrong. The Foundation was a place of control, of strict protocols and rigid structures, but the things it contained were anything but. They walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway, the walls seeming to close in around them. Harper led him to a large, reinforced door, much like the one he had seen earlier. This one, however, had a viewing window that offered a glimpse inside. Ethan peered through the glass, his breath catching in his throat. There it was, SCP-173, standing in the center of the room like some twisted, grotesque parody of art. Its head was slightly tilted, its eyes, if they could be called that, staring blankly ahead. The sight of it was unnerving in a way that went beyond reason. It was just a statue, after all, but there was something in the stillness, something that hinted at the violence lying dormant within it. "Ready?" Harper's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and clear. Ethan forced himself to nod. "Yes." The door opened with a heavy clang, the sound reverberating through the room like a death knell. Ethan stepped inside, the air colder, heavier than before. 2 other men were already in the room, both dressed in identical Foundation uniforms, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on SCP-173. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing them in. "Eyes on it at all times," one of the men said, his voice low, almost a growl. "No blinking, unless someone else is looking. You got that, new guy?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight, his eyes already beginning to sting from the effort of keeping them open. "I got it." They stood in a rough triangle around SCP-173, the room deathly silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity as Ethan fought the urge to blink, to look away, to do anything but stare at the thing in front of him. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, his pulse quickening with every passing moment. And then, without warning, the lights flickered. It was just a brief flicker, a momentary lapse in the power, but it was enough. In that split second, SCP-173 moved. Ethan didn't see it happen. None of them did. But the statue was suddenly closer, its face inches from one of the men. The man gasped, a choked sound that ended as abruptly as it began. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bones snapping, and then the man crumpled to the floor, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. "Jesus Christ," the other man yelled, his eyes wide with terror. "Keep looking at it," Harper's voice barked through the intercom, but Ethan could barely process the words. His heart was pounding in his chest, a cold sweat dripping down his back. The reality of what he was dealing with hit him all at once, the gravity of the situation crashing down on him like a wave. This wasn't just a job. It was a fight for survival. "Switch shifts," the remaining man yelled, his voice trembling. "Now." Ethan blinked, his eyes burning from the strain. The other man took over, his gaze locked on SCP-173, the tension in the room ratcheting up with each passing second. Ethan could feel his pulse racing, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Calm down, Wallace," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. But there was no calming down. Not here. not in the presence of something that defied every law of nature, every rule of logic. They continued the rotation, the minutes dragging on like hours, each one more agonizing than the last. Ethan's nerves were frayed, his body shaking with the effort of staying focused, staying alive. The sense of impending doom was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother him with every breath. And then, mercifully, the door opened again. "Time's up," Harper said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're done." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He backed out of the room, his eyes never leaving SCP-173, until he was safely outside. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in the narrow corridor. He leaned against the wall, his legs weak, his heart pounding. "Welcome to the SCP Foundation," Harper said, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "Get used to it. This is just the beginning." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could think about was the man who had been alive only moments ago, now lying dead on the cold, concrete floor. The reality of the SCP Foundation had hit him with brutal force, shattering any illusions he might have had about what he had signed up for. And in that moment, Ethan Wallace realized that this place, this job, was far more dangerous, far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The corridors of Site-19 had taken on a different quality since the incident with SCP-173. They were no longer just the sterile, metal passageways that had greeted Dr. Ethan Wallace on his first day. Now they felt narrower, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching farther than they should. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, once a constant, now felt like the distant, droning buzz of something alive, something watching. Or maybe it was his imagination. He couldn't be sure anymore. Ethan's sleep had been restless, haunted by the image of the man whose neck had been snapped like a twig. The sound of it, the wet, final crack, replayed in his mind every time he closed his eyes. He had thought he could handle this, that he was prepared for what the SCP Foundation had to offer. But the truth was far different from the academic theories he'd studied. This was real, visceral, and it was gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Today, his assignment was to assist with SCP-096. The creature's file was even more unnerving than SCP-173's. SCP-096 was a tall, emaciated humanoid, its skin pale as death, its eyes sunken and lifeless. It remained docile most of the time, but if anyone so much as glimpsed its face, whether in person, via photograph, or on video, it would fly into a berserk rage. Nothing could stop it once it had been triggered, not until it had hunted down and killed whoever had seen it. Ethan shuddered as he walked, the details of the file swimming in his head. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, the sound bouncing back at him from all directions, making it feel as though he wasn't alone. He hadn't seen another person since he left his quarters. The SCP Foundation was vast, but it was never this deserted. There should have been guards, researchers, someone, but there was no one. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping out of sight just as he turned his head. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was it just his imagination? The lights flickered again, and for a moment the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, until they swallowed the light entirely. Ethan blinked, and everything was normal again, the corridor just as it had been. "Get a grip, Wallace," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. His destination was the containment chamber for SCP-096, but the more he walked, the more disoriented he became. Every corridor looked the same, every turn led to another identical passageway. It was as though the facility itself was shifting, warping around him. He pulled out his handheld monitor, but the screen was a blur of static. The map, usually a reliable guide, was now nothing more than a mess of jagged lines and flickering images. He was lost. The hum of the lights seemed louder now, more insistent, like the buzzing of 1,000 angry insects. Ethan's pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He wiped it away with a trembling hand, his skin clammy to the touch. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. There was something here, something just out of sight, watching, waiting. He reached the end of a corridor, where a door marked with the designation SCP-096 loomed ahead. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in the silence. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's control panel. What would he find on the other side? The file had been clear: do not, under any circumstances, look at its face. But what if that was inevitable? What if something went wrong? The door slid open with a low hiss, revealing the containment chamber beyond. The room was dark, lit only by a few flickering overhead lights. In the center, crouched in a corner, was SCP-096. Its gaunt figure was barely visible, shrouded in shadows, its long, spindly arms wrapped around its knees. It rocked back and forth, a low, mournful keening sound emanating from its throat. Ethan's breath hitched. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence, but there was something about it, something deeply wrong. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. "Dr. Wallace," a voice crackled over the intercom, startling him. It was Harper, her tone as emotionless as ever. "Proceed with the observation. Remember, no visual contact with its face." Ethan nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. He forced himself to step forward, his legs feeling like lead. The keening grew louder as he approached, a pitiful, wailing sound that seemed to echo in his mind, burrowing deep into his thoughts. He kept his eyes fixed on SCP-096's body, avoiding its head at all costs. But the urge to look was overwhelming, a primal curiosity that gnawed at him, whispering in his ear. He reached the observation station at the far end of the room, where a series of monitors displayed live feeds from various cameras in the facility. One of the screens flickered, showing a brief glimpse of SCP-096's face before the image cut out entirely. Ethan recoiled, his heart slamming against his ribs. Had he seen it? Was that enough to trigger it? "Calm down," he told himself, though his voice was shaky. "It was just a flicker. It doesn't count." But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if it did count? What if the creature was already on the brink of a rampage, waiting for him to slip up? The keening grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with its eerie, bone-chilling sound. Ethan tried to focus on the monitors, but his vision was blurring, his mind racing with fear. He could feel the creature's presence, a cold, suffocating weight in the air. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken fears, the lights flickered again. The room was plunged into darkness, the monitors cutting out with a crackle of static. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the darkness pressing in around him like a living thing. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the sense of impending doom. He swept the light across the room, his heart pounding in his ears. SCP-096 was still in the corner, but it had stopped rocking. It was still too still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. Ethan backed away, the beam of his flashlight trembling. He needed to get out, needed to get away from this place. But as he turned, something caught his eye, a shadow, a movement in the darkness. He swung the light around, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. The keening started again. But this time it was different, sharper, angrier. Ethan's pulse quickened, his fear spiking. He couldn't take it anymore. He turned and bolted for the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the shadows alive with movement, with whispers. He reached the door, slamming his hand on the control panel. It didn't budge. Panic surged through him, his mind racing. He pounded on the panel again, the door refusing to open. Behind him, the keening grew louder, a wail of fury that sent a chill down his spine. "Open, damn it," Ethan shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The door finally slid open, and he stumbled out into the corridor, his legs barely holding him up. He didn't stop running until he reached the nearest guard station, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his heart racing like a drumbeat in his chest. The guards looked at him, their expressions unreadable, but he didn't care. He was out. He was safe. Or so he told himself. But even as he stood there, trembling and gasping for breath, the shadows seemed to close in around him, the whispers following him, the sense of something unseen, something malevolent, always just out of sight. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The alarms blared through the halls of Site 19, a deafening wail that reverberated off the cold steel walls and sent a jolt of raw fear through Dr. Ethan Wallace's veins. The red emergency lights pulsed in time with the alarms, casting everything in a sickly, blood-colored glow. He was running, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the situation crushing down on him like a vice. Containment breach. Containment breach in sectors B through D. The voice over the intercom was frantic, the usual calm, controlled tone of the Foundation shattered by panic. Ethan turned a corner, nearly colliding with a group of guards sprinting in the opposite direction. Their faces were masks of terror, their eyes wide and wild. One of them yelled something at him. He couldn't make out the words over the din of the alarms, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was survival. He had to get out, had to escape the madness that had engulfed the facility. The corridors were a maze, once familiar but now twisted by the urgency of fear. Every turn, every door was another gamble, another chance to run straight into the jaws of something unspeakable. The Foundation's walls, usually so secure, now felt like they were closing in, trapping him in a nightmare of his own making. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his system. He could hear the chaos unfolding around him, distant screams, the sharp crack of gunfire, the guttural roars of things that should not exist. Every sound sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through him, each one a reminder of the horrors contained within the Foundation's walls. Horrors that were now loose. He rounded another corner and found himself in the main corridor leading to the surface elevators. The long hallway stretched out before him, a gauntlet of flickering lights and shifting shadows. He wasn't alone. Others were fleeing too, scientists and guards, all of them driven by the same primal instinct to survive. But there was something wrong. The air was different, thicker, charged with a kind of malevolence that Ethan could feel crawling over his skin. He didn't have time to question it. The shadows at the far end of the corridor began to shift, coalescing into something solid, something impossibly fast. SCP-096. The creature's pale, emaciated form appeared out of the darkness, its limbs long and gangly, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. It was moving with horrifying speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Ethan didn't need to see its face to know what was coming. The sheer terror in the eyes of those around him was enough. "Run," someone shouted, though it was a futile command. Panic erupted like a wildfire. People scattered, some frozen in place by fear, others tripping over each other in their desperate attempt to escape. Ethan's legs moved on their own, driven by the primal need to survive. But no matter how fast he ran, it wasn't enough. SCP-096 was faster, its horrific wail cutting through the chaos, a sound that drilled into Ethan's skull and threatened to tear his mind apart. The corridor became a scene from a nightmare. Blood splattered the walls as SCP-096 tore through those unlucky enough to be in its path, its rage unstoppable, its strength inhuman. The screams of the dying filled the air, mingling with the alarms and the creature's unholy wail. Ethan could feel the heat of the blood as it sprayed across his face, the warm, sticky fluid a visceral reminder of the fate that awaited him if he faltered. He wasn't thinking anymore. There was no room for thought, only the instinct to keep moving. He burst through a side door, slamming it shut behind him, his hands shaking so badly he could barely lock it. The door was thick, reinforced, but it wouldn't hold for long. Not against something like SCP-096. The room he'd stumbled into was dark, lit only by the flickering emergency lights. It looked like a storage room, filled with shelves and crates that cast long, ominous shadows across the floor. Ethan crouched behind one of the crates, trying to quiet his breathing, his heart hammering so loudly in his chest he was sure it would give him away. He could hear it. SCP-096 was close, its breath a ragged, rasping sound that filled the hallway outside. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. He was trapped. The door was the only exit, and beyond it was certain death. The door shook as something heavy slammed against it, the metal groaning under the strain. Ethan bit down on his lip, trying to stifle the whimper that threatened to escape. He could feel tears welling up, the panic rising like bile in his throat. This was it. This was how he was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the banging stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant sounds of chaos still tearing through the facility. Ethan didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity, but SCP-096 didn't come through the door. Finally, when he could stand it no longer, Ethan peeked out from behind the crate. The door was still there, still intact, but the creature was gone. Somehow, impossibly, it had moved on. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body trembling with relief and terror. He needed to move, needed to get out before it came back. He crept toward the door, his footsteps slow and cautious, his ears straining for any sign of the creature's return. The hallway was empty when he emerged, the bodies of the fallen lying in twisted, grotesque poses, their blood pooling on the cold concrete floor. The sight of it turned Ethan's stomach, but he forced himself to keep moving. There was no time to think, no time to mourn. Survival was the only priority. He made his way through the corridors, every step a battle against the fear that threatened to paralyze him. The facility was in shambles, the containment breaches having unleashed a nightmarish menagerie of horrors. Ethan saw glimpses of other CPs as he moved, twisted shapes in the darkness, strange, alien sounds that set his teeth on edge. He avoided them all, using every ounce of his training, every shred of his willpower to stay alive. Finally, he reached the elevator to the surface, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body screaming in protest. He slammed his hand on the call button, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, expecting SCP-096, or something worse, to come barreling down the corridor after him. The doors slid open with a soft chime and Ethan practically fell inside, his fingers stabbing at the button for the surface level. The doors closed, sealing him in, and the elevator began its ascent. For the first time since the alarms had sounded, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe, to hope that he might actually survive this. But even as the elevator climbed, the memories of what he had seen, of what he had done to survive, weighed heavily on his mind. The horrors of the SCP Foundation were no longer just stories in a file, they were real, and they had changed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As the elevator neared the surface, Ethan knew one thing for certain: the SCP Foundation had its secrets, but some things were better left in the dark, and if he made it out of this alive, he would never look back. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the bright, sterile lobby of Site-19's surface level. The contrast between this clean, orderly space and the chaos below was jarring. Dr. Ethan Wallace stumbled out, his legs trembling, his mind still reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. The silence up here was oppressive, a stark reminder of the screams and gunfire that echoed through the facility's lower levels. But now there was only silence. He felt like a ghost, moving through the lobby as if in a dream. There were no guards, no staff, just the empty, clinical white of the walls and the distant hum of machinery. The place that had once seemed so intimidating now felt hollow, as though all life had been sucked out of it, leaving nothing but a shell. Ethan's hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his key card. The small piece of plastic was all that stood between him and freedom. And yet, as he approached the final door, he hesitated. There was a weight in his chest, a cold, gnawing doubt that rooted him to the spot. He had survived, but at what cost? The things he had seen, the people he had lost, could he really just walk away from it all? The door to the outside world loomed before him, an unassuming barrier between the life he had known and the world beyond. He swiped his keycard, the lock disengaging with a soft click. But before he could push it open, he paused, his mind flashing back to the last moments in the elevator, the fleeting sense of relief that had been crushed by the reality of what he had been through. It wasn't just about escaping now. It was about understanding, about facing the truth he had been avoiding since he first set foot in the Foundation. With a deep breath, Ethan turned away from the door and walked to the observation deck at the far end of the lobby. The glass walls overlooked the vast forest that surrounded the facility, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, oblivious to the horrors hidden beneath the earth. He placed his hands on the cool glass, staring out at the untouched landscape, a world that seemed so normal, so peaceful. But it wasn't, was it? The SCP Foundation had shown him that much. The world was teetering on the brink of something unimaginable, held together by secrets and lies, by forces that should never have been unleashed. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a vice. He had come here to do good, to make a difference, but what he had found was something far darker. The Foundation wasn't just containing these entities, it was studying them, experimenting on them, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, of what should be known. And for what? To protect humanity, or to control it? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more damning than the last. He thought of SCP-173, of SCP-096, of the countless others locked away in the bowels of the facility. Monsters, yes, but also victims in a way. Victims of humanity's insatiable curiosity, of its need to understand and dominate everything it touched. What right did they have to play God? He opened his eyes, staring out at the forest once more. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. It was beautiful, in its way, a stark contrast to the darkness he had just escaped. But even as he admired the view, the knowledge of what lay beneath his feet tainted it, a reminder that the world was not as simple as it appeared. The door behind him slid open, and he turned to see Agent Harper stepping into the room. Her face was as expressionless as ever, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of something deeper, something human. She walked over to him, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. "You made it," she said, her voice flat. Ethan nodded, unable to find the words to respond. There was nothing to say, really. They both knew what he had been through, what he had seen. "You're free to go," Harper continued, but there was no warmth in her words. "If that's what you want." Ethan looked at her, searching her face for some sign of emotion, some acknowledgement of the nightmare he had endured. But there was nothing. She was the perfect agent of the Foundation, cold and detached, a cog in a machine that had long since lost sight of its purpose. "Is this it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this all there is?" Harper tilted her head, as if considering the question. "This is the SCP Foundation, Dr. Wallace. We do what we must to protect humanity. Sometimes that means making difficult choices." Difficult choices. Ethan's voice cracked with the weight of everything he had seen. "Is that what you call this? Containing these things, experimenting on them. How is that protecting humanity?" "We protect humanity by understanding the threats it faces," Harper replied, her tone unwavering. "By learning from them, by controlling them. It's not always pretty, but it's necessary. Ethan turned back to the window, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. And if one of those things gets loose? If something goes wrong? Then we deal with it, Harper said simply. As we always do. There was a finality in her words that left no room for argument. The Foundation wasn't going to change. It couldn't. It was too entrenched in its mission, too bound by the secrets it kept. And yet, as Ethan stood there, staring out at the setting sun, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with that mission. Maybe it was the things he had seen, the people he had lost, or maybe it was just the simple, undeniable truth that had been gnawing at him since that first day some things weren't meant to be understood, weren't meant to be controlled. "Are you coming?" Harper asked, her voice softer now, almost gentle. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like never before. To stay meant to accept the Foundation's methods, to become part of the machine that had nearly destroyed him. To leave meant walking away from the only thing that could keep the world safe, or at least that's what they told themselves. Finally, he turned away from the window, meeting Harper's gaze with a calm he didn't quite feel. "No," he said quietly, "I'm done." She didn't argue, didn't try to convince him otherwise. She simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. He walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby, each step feeling like it was carrying him farther away from the person he had been, the person who had walked into the Foundation full of hope and ambition. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, filling his lungs with a freshness he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. The sky was a deep, rich purple now, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the distance. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in, letting the reality of the world wash over him. This was his choice, his freedom. But even as he walked away from Site 19, from the horrors he had faced, he knew that the shadows of the Foundation would follow him, that the knowledge of what lay beneath the earth would never truly leave him. And as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan Wallace understood one final truth: the SCP Foundation wasn't just a place. It was an idea, a force, something that could never be fully escaped. It was a Pandora's box, and now that it was open, it could never be closed. And somewhere, deep within him, a small voice whispered the question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Was it worth it?